Hello, everybody. I'm Dan Limbach, producer of the Pharma Voice Webcast Network, and I'll be your moderator today. Welcome to our event entitled Addressing Unmet Needs of Patients and Providers in Rare and Complex Disease, brought to you by Pharma Voice in partnership with our good friends at VMS Biomarketing. We have an outstanding crowd today with executives from across the industry. Thank you for investing the time to attend. We'll certainly do our very best to make it worth your while. We have a very knowledgeable tandem of experts with us today to help us understand the unmet needs of patients and providers in the rare and complex disease space and how to address those needs. I'll provide you with some background on our experts. We have Andrea Heslin-Smiley, President and Chief Executive Officer at VMS Biomarketing. Andrea joined VMS in 2008 to lead the company's strategic marketing and brand development business units and was named President and CEO in 2011. Prior to joining VMS, Andi spent 18 years at Eli Lilly and Company, leading multiple business units and product strategies. She is a recognized leader on patient and provider engagement and adherence, and she consults with a wide range of leading pharmaceutical and biotech company clients, providing advice on strategy, adherence, and behavior change with a particular focus on rare disease. She is a regularly invited speaker and panel member at industry conferences. Andi serves on the board of directors of the Egalit Corporation and several nonprofit boards. She earned her BA in economics from DePauw University, where she was an honors management fellow. We also have Tammy Moscatello, RN, OCN, who is a clinical nurse educator at VMS Biomarketing. Tammy has been a registered nurse for 17 years with a background in both inpatient and outpatient clinical settings. Tammy worked for 7 years at the H. Lee Moffitt Cancer Center and Research Institute, helping oncology patients in diverse areas of cancer treatment, including CNS disorders. She joined VMS Biomarketing in 2016 and has worked across multiple rare disease categories. She achieved the Oncology Certified Nurse designation in 2008 and is now pursuing a graduate degree in a Master of Science in Nursing Educator program. Tammy enjoys partnering with her pharmaceutical sales representatives and industry-based educators. She is passionate about sharing her disease education experience and nursing knowledge to better serve patients. Based on the excellent turnout today, it's clearly an area of interest, and based on our esteemed panel, it promises to be an informative session. I'm definitely looking forward to it. Andrea is going to start off the presentation, during which we'll have a few audience polls, so get ready to participate. Immediately after the presentation, we'll have some Q&A time to address questions submitted by the audience. Andrea, you have the floor.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you all for participating. We hope that there's some good information that you'll find valuable and different insights that you may not have had prior to today. So first, let me just go through the topics that we are going to discuss in the next hour. Starting first with just landscape of the rare disease marketplace, something that I'm sure most everyone is aware of, but it's a good foundation for us to start. We'll then go into unmet needs and barriers. At that point, we're going to have several different polling questions for you all to participate in. We'll then move to strategies, specifically what things can be done to overcome these barriers and address the needs both of the patient and of providers. Tammy's then going to take us into real-world examples and very recent examples of rare disease case studies that I think will be insightful. And then we will talk about where would you use nurse educators? How are they applied across the life cycle of drugs? So first, let's just look at the marketplace for rare disease. So there's estimated 400 million people worldwide that currently are living with a rare disease. 30 million of those are in the U.S. So that's approximately 1 in 10 Americans has a rare disease. When we look at sales, worldwide orphan drug sales are expected to grow with a compounded annual growth rate of 11.3%. Compared to 2017, the market was growing at a much slower rate, and so we're seeing this uptick. In fact, it's double the growth rate of non-orphan drug market, which is really around 6.4%. So we expect orphan drug sales, to continue to climb and get to $260 billion by 2024, and that's representing 20% of all prescription sales, and as compared to 2017, that was only 16% of total sales. So a disproportionate amount of sales relative to the population, and the market continues to grow, and we don't see that slowing down. So while this growth is strong, and this is obviously a very attractive market, there continues to be great, unique, and even overwhelming challenges in treating rare diseases, both from healthcare professional and the provider standpoint, as well as the patient perspective. So when we look at some of those, let's first start with the provider. There is a vast number of diseases, 6,000 to 8,000 rare diseases, and even more so, the amount of information that continues to come out about these new diseases, which is important and valuable, but at times can be overwhelming, given the amount of information that then healthcare professionals need to digest and understand. With this huge amount of information, then comes the difficulty in being able to identify and diagnose patients with the rare diseases that they have. And so we see that patients are often faced with inaccurate diagnosis when they originally seek care. In fact, it takes up to 5 years, 7 different physicians to get to the right diagnosis. And often there being 2 to 3 misdiagnoses that have happened along the way. So the patients have believed that they've been appropriately diagnosed, and then it's been identified that they were not the right diagnoses. It's no doubt then that in the Journal of Rare Disease, 44%, so nearly half of patients agreed that because of this slow diagnosis, their treatment, of course, was delayed, and there was an impact on their condition that was negatively causing them to get to the right type of outcomes. The upshot here is there's much to be done in the rare disease space to better meet the educational and the support needs of patients and providers. So that starts now. We want to get to our first polling question. Given the diverse challenges of rare diseases and then the collective experience that all of you have that are on the call, we want to hear from you what you believe are the greatest barriers that impact diagnosis and management. We're first going to focus on HCPs. So if you will, think about the most significant barrier. There's obviously a plethora of barriers, but we're trying to get to you answering just the one most specific barrier that providers face in diagnosing rare and complex diseases. The 5 examples we have here are barriers for you to choose from. Is first, infrequency of the rare disease type. What we mean by that is, given there's 1 in 10 patients that have rare disease and there's such a large number of rare diseases, the infrequency of seeing the same type of rare disease patient is a barrier for HCPs to be able to diagnose. Differently is then the lack of disease awareness, just not being familiar with the specifics of all the different types of diseases. Misdiagnosis, and what we mean by this is sort of an overconfidence in a current diagnosis, or not then the time or the curiosity to be able to dig deeper and recognize that that diagnosis could be inappropriate. 4th is the lack of product knowledge and availability of products to treat. So less urgency to diagnose because one doesn't believe that there is a therapy out there to treat. And then the last one being time constraints, which is self-explanatory. So Dan, if you want to kick that off.
Absolutely. So the live template is up. The audience can now make their selections. Just choose one of the circles to the left of those 5 answers. Okay, so in first place was lack of disease awareness, followed by infrequency of seeing patients with specific rare diseases, and it goes down from there. Andrea, were you surprised by these results, or is that about what you expected?
No, this is good. This is pretty spot on. There's some differences in number 1 and number 2 from when we did our nurse survey, but not surprised at all. I think this, obviously, it's a knowledgeable group on the call. So if we do just go to the results that we've seen then from our nurses, we then surveyed our nurses, and these are nurses that have had considerable experience in rare diseases like Tammy. We have several hundred that participated in these surveys. And what they found was that the number 1 was infrequency of seeing the disease type, but a close there second then was a lack of disease awareness, so consistent with what we were hearing from the audience. 3rd being a lack of product knowledge and availability, and particularly given that 95% of rare diseases do not currently have a treatment option, we know that making sure that healthcare professionals are aware of the diseases that are, the products that are available on the market when they do come to market, it's important to get that information out. Time constraints and also misdiagnosis. So, not inconsistent with what we've heard from the audience. We're going to come back to what we do with this and how we address these barriers, but we will do that first after we do our second polling question. And so the second one is now focusing on managing rare diseases. So we talked about the barriers to diagnosing. Now we're focusing specifically on managing. So what are the most significant barriers HCPs face in managing rare and complex disease? Reimbursement and cost, and what we mean by that is the difficulty in particular that the office staff can have with benefits investigation processes and different types of processes across different drugs. Time constraints, and this one, less than the diagnosing. This in particular is given that rare disease patients require longer and more frequent visits, that often that can be a difficulty in managing diseases from the healthcare professional standpoint. Product knowledge here is about keeping track and being aware of the idiosyncrasies of the different product types. Side effect management, many of the different products available in the market do have sometimes significant side effect profiles, and that requires more time and effort and knowledge on the healthcare professional side. And then coordination of care. Multiple diagnostics are often needed, other physicians testing, could be physical therapy, but just coordination of all the care. So we want to go ahead and vote on this polling question.
Yep, the template's up, Joe. Same drill as last time, just click on one of the circles next to one of the 5 possible answers. The audience was pretty savvy on the first one. We'll see how they do on this one. We'll close this and share the results. Okay, well, this was a little bit tighter. We've got 3 kind of all in the same area. Reimbursement costs at 31%, coordination of care at 30%, and product knowledge at 26%. What do you think about this, Andrea?
This is actually very close, particularly with reimbursement being number 1. So if we go to our nursing survey, the number 1 area, again, that aligns directly with the respondents, is reimbursement and cost. And so there's always great opportunity for that to be streamlined, and while at the same time we all recognize that it's not getting any easier in terms of working through the benefits investigation, but that's the number 1 area. What the nurses found were equally the second area were the time constraints needed as well as the lack of product knowledge, and then the last 2 being side effect management and coordination. So pretty consistent with what we were seeing from the audience as well. So now that we know what the barriers are and there's sort of consistency in understanding what the most significant ones are, we want to turn to what strategies we can employ to address these barriers. And we're first going to focus on HCPs and really what type of education is needed for them to be able to maximize their time and provide the best care for their patients. So we talked about infrequency of seeing patients, lack of disease, and product knowledge and time constraints. All 3 of these relate to the amount of information that is out there, the number of diseases, and all that the HCPs need to be internalizing to be able to be providing appropriate care, being able to more quickly diagnose patients and then also treat them. I think the most important thing for us all to remember is there's no way that with all that's going on with physicians and their number 1 concern often being that they have less amount of time than they've ever had before, and that continues to be squeezed, that there is a need for continuous education about the disease, about the product, about the support services. I think there are times when we believe that there could be one and done, particularly when we're incorporating support services like nurse educators, that once we explain it once to the office staff about benefits investigation or about the support services that are available, that we believe that they would be able to retain that information, even if it's multiple times. What we have heard over and over and what we've seen work is the need for continuous education around these key areas that we cannot assume that they're going to remember. Now, to be able to provide this type of education and have it be something that's welcomed by healthcare professionals, we need to make sure that it's relevant, and we need to make sure that it is being provided to them in a way that meets their needs. So personalizing what type of information is most important to the different types of healthcare professionals. So it's different for the provider versus the nursing staff versus the office manager, and making sure that it's not the same information, that it's kept fresh. It's obvious, but it is not done nearly in the way that it needs to be done, and often it's a reason that many healthcare professionals are not interested in allowing, additional educational information to come in. They need to know and see that it's most relevant, it's most up-to-date information. Third part is timing is everything. Again, this is not brain surgery, but it is something that we see is not done, and Tammy's going to actually talk a little bit about this as well, that is not done in a way that's thoughtful about the needs of the office. Even the hours that we have sales reps and nurse educators and FRMs working are not always the most conducive for many offices. So it's understanding their daily routine. It may be, particularly if it's in a hospital setting, it could be very early in the morning. That's the most valuable time before they're doing rounds. It can be later in the evening when no one else is there. We tend to use the lunch as one of the most key components, and I still believe that's an important way to providing education, but it is asking the question and understanding when is the best time to provide educational and services. Likewise, to be thoughtful about the types of resources and educational materials that are being provided for them to provide to their patients. Many times it's not as easy as it should be. It can be very complicated or bulky materials. There needs to be much more streamlined materials that can be used, again, given all the different diseases that they are addressing and needing to stay on top of. Making the support materials as straightforward and intuitive for their use, so they don't have to relearn it every time they're bringing it up, is a key to them actually using those resources. And then the last point is around the office nurse, and it's a key stakeholder that is often under-recognized in terms of the integral role they play, and particularly in patient education. We did a poll of physicians, and they said that 97% of them believe that the office nurse is integral to the success of patient initiation and compliance. We know that nurses provide the majority of patient education and onboarding, especially for new products. So ensuring that materials are tailored to them, that they are a focused component of providing education, and recognizing how they want to receive that education. Office nurses have rated live peer-to-peer, so nurse-to-nurse education, as one of the most effective ways for them to gain new knowledge and for them to sort of relate to that information as a peer will be providing kind of that perspective. And in fact, that is a little bit of also what we're going to be hearing from Tammy when she talks about providing that kind of education to other nurses. So next, we want to move into our last polling question, and now we're going to be focusing in on patients. So this question is, what is the most significant barrier patients face in managing a rare complex disease? So we're not focusing on the diagnosis. We are now saying that once they're on a disease, what are the greatest barriers to their managing or being adherent to the therapy that they're on? First one is access and cost. I think that's one self-explanatory. Isolation and hopelessness. This is sort of the emotional strains and the lack of support and empathy that rare disease patients disproportionately go through. Not knowing what to expect from their medications, so not being aware of whether or not the product is working appropriately, and so not having sort of a clear expectation of what they should be looking for in terms of side effects, how they know if the drug is working, that sort of thing. Disease awareness and education just in general. If there's more information that can be valuable to them managing their disease, is that a barrier? And then the logistics and the care coordination that go into managing a rare disease. So Dan?
All right, we're going to put the audience to work one more time. Let's close it up and share the results. So we've got a clear leader this time, access and cost, and then they're all kind of in the same area, the other four. So Andrea, what do you think about these results?
Well, they're a little bit different from what we've seen from our nurse survey, but I do believe that by far and the largest one continues to be access and cost, and we know that continues to grow, and having good support services for that is important. So if we turn to the nurse survey, there is some discrepancy. I think far and large, though, we know access and cost, and I definitely believe that the number one area across the board, of course, is dealing with sort of the challenges around that. Then I think what the audience had was sort of an equal distribution across the rest of these, and so it's not that dissimilar. We had logistics of care being a little bit less of a area that seems to be a barrier. But if we talk about these, I think the isolation and hopelessness, again, the lack of support, the lack of empathy, understanding what patients are going through. We've heard quite a bit about that, not only from our nurses, but also from our patient advisory boards and panels that we talk about. So we'll talk a little bit about that in our strategies. The disease awareness and education. I think this one is quite interesting because we know that rare disease patients are some of the most well-informed and they're voracious readers on their disease. And yet what we consistently hear is that they still want more resources, they still want more information, more education. It's an area that makes them feel greater confidence and control of their disease. So it continues to be a place that can influence greater adherence. Knowing what to expect, of course, is a critical component as well. And then what we have is logistics of care, which again, it depends on the disease type. That can be a significant area. So what do we do about all these, and how do we address these barriers so that patients can achieve the outcomes that they deserve that are available? Across the board, from a patient perspective, and again, I believe that I'm probably preaching to the choir. All of you know this, but it can never be underestimated the sort of arduous path that these patients have been through when they finally get to the right diagnosis. I mean, we cannot underestimate the degree of frustration, exhaustion, sort of turmoil, and thus really the tremendous amount of support that is needed and that they deserve, honestly, and that they want. And I think that support comes in sort of two different components. It is the types of actual resources that need to be provided to them, and it's the way in which then those resources are given to them and the manner in which they are meaningful and they're helping them. So what I mean by that is that this hand-holding, not just providing support, but really making sure that they understand what it is and helping them through the process has been a key component to the improved adherence that we've seen in so many of our rare disease programs. Engaging a single point of contact to problem solve and navigate, over-communicating. I think particularly given the amount of effort and time that can go into the benefits investigation, there can be a long lag from when the patients start in that initiation with a hub provider, if you will. But providing status updates, translating the information the patients are getting, not only to the patients, but also to the caregivers, it's really important. Taking the time to listen is so important. So the first one by far is recognizing the level of support that is needed. Secondly is that support needs to be personalized. There are very different types of struggles that patients have, and particularly within rare disease, there are certain situations that will have, made a significant impact in their journey throughout this disease management. And understanding what those issues are and being able to relate the support to them and being able to relate any of the content to those specific areas is not only valuable, but it shows the level of concern that we all do have for rare disease patients. So using behavioral assessments, of course, those are kind of the broader, but then getting down to very personalizing the care. And we're going to talk about how we do that in just a minute. And of course, greater education and setting expectations. Rare disease patients, they crave this additional information, as we were saying before, and it's connecting them not only educating them on disease and that thing, but also making sure that they're aware of other advocacy groups, national resources, support groups. We've even had many nurses even help them begin their own advocacy group because there might not have been in a particularly rare disease area. So there's a common theme throughout all of these specifics, which is about the need for personalized support and the importance of a human connection. And we do believe that disproportionately for rare diseases, providing encouragement, motivation that comes from a human-to-human contact cannot be undervalued. It's a way of making sure that there's the empathy and that there is an understanding of what they're going through. And we believe it's particularly important in this connected age and given all that's going on. So in my humble opinion, no one does that better than a nurse. And I want to touch on why I believe nurses do that so well. They play a number of different critical roles that are important to overcoming barriers for both patients and providers. They have this unbelievable knack, and Tammy is a great example of this, of being able to wear so many different hats and knowing when to put on which hat or when to be moving quickly between different hats. But it is from being the educator and the teacher. And specifically, we are looking for and we hire nurses that have rare disease experience, and where possible, that they have the specific rare disease experience. We actually also look for nurses who may have even had their own personal experience in rare disease, not just in therapeutic area. They're problem solvers. A key part is also that they're translators. They are helping ensure that there is a stronger relationship between the physician and the provider, never getting in the way of the provider, but only enabling and serving. Often at times we even think of it as sort of like a marriage counselor, providing good communication techniques to be able to enhance that relationship. They're a counselor addressing emotional needs. They hold patients accountable, and they help them navigate through all the logistical components that rare diseases are posing. To bring all this to life, I'm now going to hand it over to Tammy, who is one of our most talented clinical educator and nurses. So she can then be able to talk about how this has been utilized in a couple of real-world examples. Tammy?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. So touching on the slide, I'm just going to say, as a nurse and in my experience, I know all too well that every patient comes with their own emotions regarding their disease, and they process things very differently when it comes to their disease and the therapy that's been prescribed. So one of the biggest insights that I've learned is that every patient's experience and situation is very unique. No patient that I have ever met comes with that one-size-fits-all type, they don't fit in that category. The most important thing that I can offer when sitting with a patient is just listening to them, just truly hearing what their needs are and really just empathizing with their concerns. So by having the ability to meet with a patient on a face-to-face level and just during that live visit, having the opportunity to connect with that patient on that personal level, I'm able to actually sit and see their facial expressions during that live visit, and that allows me to pick up on their emotional and verbal cues. So doing so, it affords me the opportunity to ask them the right questions and understand what their thought process is. Basically gear their education towards their needs regarding therapy. As a nurse, we have that natural ability to really listen to our patients and hear what their needs are. And we're used to guiding and navigating them through the process and having empathy for their concerns. And in turn, that builds a really trusting relationship with a patient. By building that trusting relationship, that can be the difference between a patient successfully moving forward in their therapy or shutting down completely because their needs and concerns have not been heard nor met. As a nurse educator, I get to see many patients in the field that are faced with multiple barriers while trying to get on therapy once that decision has been made by the physician and the patient. And in the case of Maggie, she was a patient who opted into the educator program, and I spoke with her over the phone because she needed a lot of help overcoming some of these barriers. During my first conversation with Maggie, I could tell that she was extremely isolated and alone in this whole process. She was receiving a lot of mixed messages and not getting the answers that she needed. And it was very overwhelming and very frustrating for her. All the phone calls that she was receiving at home were very confusing because some were coming from the specialty pharmacy, the insurance company, and the hub that actually verifies the insurance. All the messages that were being left for her were regarding something that she needed to do, but none of them were focused on what she actually needed. So Maggie, she expressed to me that she just needed somebody to listen and help her sort through the mixed messages, just to ask the right questions and help to educate and guide her on the correct process, and just be that advocate on her behalf. So by being that one go-to person for Maggie, this resulted in her being able to successfully start on her prescribed therapy. And then the end result in all this was that by having that live face-to-face visit with Maggie, I was able to educate and support her while receiving treatment, which is extremely important to patients on these complex therapies. So moving on to HPC case study, I've touched on the many barriers that are faced by patients on complex therapies, but as a nurse that has worked in a clinic environment, I also understand the barriers that are faced by healthcare providers. So after the decision has been made to move forward with therapy, there are a lot of educational needs that the staff has, as well as the patients. So in Dr. R's busy oncology practice, the new products were becoming too overwhelming for his primary clinic nurse. She was having a lot of trouble keeping the dosing schedules and side effects straight on the product. So Dr. R had decided to invite me to provide an educational in-service for his staff to educate on the product and the side effect profile. From my background working in a clinic setting, I've learned that scheduling and timing is definitely a key component because of the time restraints that are found within a busy practice. In this case, it just made sense to schedule the session in the morning prior to clinic in order not to disrupt the office workflow. I had also made sure that I tailored that education to meet the needs of the clinic staff, so it was relevant to that office. And with this clinic, I wound up spending a lot of time on dosing schedules and side effects. So during the session, I was also made aware that the new staff were just hired to come in, and that allowed me to schedule future educational sessions geared towards their needs. So ultimately, the relationship that I had built with that primary nurse and the education provided to the staff, that was found to be essential in helping them get their patients started on therapy once that decision had been made between the patient and the physician. So I'm going to go ahead and hand this back over to Andrea.
Thanks, Tammy. That was great, and hopefully that helps bring some of these things to life to you all. What you've heard from Tammy, and we're probably going to sound like a broken record, we continue to make this point, but the most critical aspect of all the type of support that's provided to patients is rare disease patients in particular, is personalization of the approach. And I want to talk about how we apply that at BMS. We are sort of a three-pronged approach, if you will. It first starts with sort of the risk assessment. There's a number of different types of risk assessments that are out there. There's the medication risk assessment tool. There's the medication adherence report scales. There's PAM. Depending on the therapeutic area, there's the appropriate type of assessment is applied. That then segments patients into their risk categories. But that's only sort of the start. That just says how much support should be provided because of the increased likelihood of risk that they might be non-adherent. The next part is then identifying sort of the individual needs that they have that would help them overcome the barriers of adherence. And that is, we developed a number of questionnaires that allow us to be able to tailor the specific way, the type of channel, the frequency, and the content to be able to get to what Tammy was talking about, then a very much more personalized, person-to-person, connecting kind of integration. It is good to note here that we also believe that when possible, we would like to get caregivers also to participate in those questionnaires, as they can also help us address certain barriers. Of course, this is only with the patient's approval and desire to have caregivers involved, which I think 99% of the time we find that they do. And then the third part of that is how we then use sort of our change model that we particularly use, one that has been adapted from the trans-theoretical model of change. And it basically just goes through, some core guiding principles of how you get people to actually move along change and sort of accept situations. Some high-level areas there are about affirming patients' behaviors and their abilities, and it's they get a lot of negative talk, so it's providing a lot of affirmation. Again, as you heard from Tammy, using reflective listening, that's not used nearly enough in the world in general, but reflecting back the patient's own words and then holding them accountable and summarizing main points, but getting them to the goals that they have outlined early on and making sure that they see the benefits of getting there. So nurse educators play an essential role in supporting patients and providers. We know that. We've talked about that. What I want to move to now is not just that they do play a role, but where can they be playing a role? Because we get asked that question often. First, I want to just look at the evolution of the educator role because it's changed quite a bit over time, and we can move through this quickly. Where 15 to 20 years ago, it was just about sort of a one-and-done injection or device training. This was disproportionately used in MS, in diabetes. Then we saw that there was sort of this evolution to, okay, there's adherence support that patients need, not just at the initiation. So you saw multiple touch points that were being included. There were, clinical call centers, so it could be face-to-face, but this then also combined with follow-up calls. And now what we're seeing is this patient centricity, much more personalized engagement. In fact, I think the best term I've heard used is patient intimacy, and it is addressing the complete ecosystem that is supporting the patient. So it's not just only the patient, it's also engaging the caregivers. It's ensuring that there's a feedback loop to the healthcare professionals, and it's addressing all of the idiosyncrasies that are related to rare diseases that have to do with logistics, that have to do with advocacy groups, meeting with patients with advocacy groups and talking with all of them. So it's a much more holistic approach that is needed for clinical educators. When we think about where they can be used along the life cycle of a drug, we typically think of sort of this middle part of the curve, if this is curve, but I think that if we look at the two ends, there are areas that often get overlooked. We're focusing most of this discussion on commercialization, but I think it's worth calling out that the role for nurse educators in clinical trials for rare diseases is invaluable. From a recruitment, how difficult it is to find the rare disease patients, they can play a key role, particularly when we're using local educators, so our on-demand model, so they understand the landscape, across the country, and so they can help find these particular patients. And then keeping the patients in the clinical trial. Any loss in a rare disease clinical trial can be detrimental to the overall results of the trial. Pre-launch, clinical educators play a key role in disease education. We just talked about how important that is for healthcare professionals to be able to then identify and diagnose patients appropriately once the product comes to market. And then throughout the commercialization, there is, of course, the HCP education, patient onboarding, patient education, the type of support we've talked about. I think a key place, too, I want to call out in the early launch stage is the value of the insights that are gathered from nurse educators. This is something that is particularly important for rare diseases because a lot of the market research can be quite thin given the small patient populations. But using nurse educators, who are the only folks that are in front of patients and gathering sort of real-world evidence, real-world data, real-world experiences, they can provide that back to the marketing teams and medical teams and across the board so that there is understanding exactly how that drug is working for those patients once it has actually come to market, and how they need to then potentially change strategies or changing messages or tweak them. So the insights gathering is incredibly important. And then at the late stage of a product, that therapy recognition programs, I mean, of course, there's ongoing, medication reminders and the health coaching that we've talked about, but it's also engaging patients to then be able to give back. Again, this is particular to rare disease. They're personally defined often by the disease and want to then be part of helping others. And so we use patients as then patient advocates or patient ambassadors. It's harder to use those at launch because it's difficult to find them and also the right type of person. So at that later stage, getting those patients to be able to then participate and support other patients is a key piece. Same with just recognizing where they are with their therapy and with their disease. The last part of sort of the tailored solution for nurse educators is and a really critical part is ensuring that nurse educators go where the patients are. So this is just a depiction of all the ways that clinical educators need to be available to support their patients. It could be in their home, it could be at their work. So many patients with rare disease have missed a lot of work, and so they even would want our clinical nurse educators to come to work and provide education or support, or meet them on their time is the key point here. In the HCP office, obviously we talked about clinical trials, participating in advocacy groups. That is a core component of all of our rare disease programs. Even meeting 50% of patients with rare disease are children, so we'll also be meeting with the caregivers, the parents, even in the infusion centers if that's where their child is getting therapy. So it's going where they need to be. Success is predicated on customizing these solutions to the patient need. Additionally, success is also predicated so much so on understanding and adhering to the importance of regulatory guidelines. So this is in the news more now than it has been, particularly over the last several weeks. And so I want to make sure that there's appropriate time is spent on this. Whatever partner you will be working with, particularly in the nurse educators area, it could be for hub services as well, but that their approach to compliance and regulatory is relentless, and that they are very deliberate in what they're doing. And all of that starts with the intent and the purpose of the program. So these are areas that you all should be scrutinizing in terms of program design and execution. Your partner should be scrutinizing. This isn't a one-time activity. This is an ongoing process that needs for continuous improvement. So first, on patient program intent and purpose. The intent in the program is education and training, period. That is the intent for the program. It is to make sure that people are supported in education and training. Patients always have the choice to opt in or out of ongoing support. There shouldn't be any kind of coercion. That, again, would not be meeting the needs of the patient. So it wouldn't be, at least for us, that would not be kind of core to what we believe is the principles of how you create a valuable program. Patient always needs to be referred back to the HCP for medical advice and not providing any kind of medical advice themselves. Interactions and influence, there shouldn't be any type of influence with the HCP. The purpose with the HCP interaction is to educate, increase awareness of support services. Engagement of patients should only happen after the decision to prescribe has been made. Really important component there. And then also on the HCP front is the value to the HCP. This education should be supplemental. It does not replace the resource that HCP should be providing. And of course, I think this goes without saying, but we'll reinforce it, program services from a nurse educator should never be billed out. That should never be happening in any situation whatsoever. So there should be no value to the HCP. And then lastly, the roles of the educator, the rep, the FRMs, the reimbursement managers need to be very clearly and distinctly identified and understood. The role of an educator is to educate. It's not to sell. Educators thus should not be compensated or metriced in any way on anything related to sales. And every interaction that they have must have a clear educational objective. The way that we ensure that we are delivering on these compliant patient programs is really through 4 different aspects of program elements. First, in recruiting and making sure that in the training and the recruiting, there's clearly defining the roles and responsibilities, as we said, across all the folks who will be interacting. Clear objectives in the program design. What often gets overlooked that needs to be happening continuously in program execution is the field observation, call monitoring, proactive audits, and quality assurance. That should be happening throughout the whole life cycle of the program, and that should be happening in collaboration with an engagement of the internal compliance and legal components of the biopharma company. That needs to happen early before the design, and it needs to happen throughout the program's life. Regulatory compliant programs can and they do deliver impactful results, and when we look at some of the results that we have seen, I believe that these are just a couple of sort of the profound positive impacts that we've had. 33% increase in patient adherence at 6 months. There's an immediate and a sustained. It goes beyond the 6 months. And 33% is a typical level. We go from anywhere from about 28 to 33%, but it is definitely, the mean is closer to 33% return. So significant impact on patient adherence. Patient confidence increases. That's directly correlated to the adherence and satisfaction of the program. From an HCP standpoint, they not only talk about the knowledge and expertise, the ability for the nurses to be able to communicate and relate to the patients and to their own office nurses, but in fact, we've seen that all come to a 78% net promoter score for the programs that we've had. The bottom line is these results are directly correlated to the trust and credibility that clinical nurse educators build with both patients and providers. And it is no wonder that nurses have been rated the #1 most trusted professional 16 years in running with the Gallup poll. They have an inherent and an innate desire to help, serve, and build deep relationships that are entirely focused on improving patient outcomes. And we believe that's the key to making a profound impact on patients and providers, that offering the empathy, trust, and a listening ear that are so inherent to nurses. We see that that's the most essential way for patients to connect in this age. So that's the end of our presentation. There is additional information that's available, as Dan had touched upon earlier, and I encourage anyone to reach out and receive that information, as well as reach out to us with any questions you have.
Absolutely. So if you want to download any of these materials, you can find it in the handout section of your control panel. And if you have any problems getting that today, you can always send us an email and we'll make sure we shoot that out to you. And you'll see that address in an upcoming slide. So the Q&A session is always a popular segment of our web seminars, and we already have some outstanding questions sent in from attendees. Please note that due to time constraints, we may not be able to respond to all questions submitted, but we'll get to as many as we can. So let's get to it, shall we? Andrea, you've been seeing the questions. Why don't you start tackling them?
Okay, first, you know what, I'm going to kick one off that Tammy will answer, and that is a topic we didn't necessarily address here, or specifically as well, and that are what are the greatest barriers you see for caregivers in facing a rare disease?
In my experience as a nurse, the caregiver takes on as many responsibilities almost as the patient. They're going through the same process. Patient is going through all these changes, and that caregiver is going through them as well. You know, they're performing many hours of care each week, often with just, helping and helping out the patient, and they get little breaks. It's this constant daily role that, that impacts them, and it impacts their employment. Sometimes, they're attending school or work, or every single day is affected by caring for the patient. So, this increases emotional stress on them, physical strain, and, sometimes declining health on a caregiver. They need education and they need support just as much as the patients. And they have these unique challenges, the same as a patient has, related to diagnosis. As far as I know, that many family caregivers report anecdotally that they experience unique challenges related to time to diagnosis and access to appropriate medical care and medications, and it's an emotional burden managing the uncertainty of the disease and its prognosis. Knowing that they have these unique barriers and they're just trying to help their loved one with the rare disease, they also need a lot of support, and also community support. Educators help, they help support the caregiver as much as the patient, and this kind of assistance makes a huge impact in the caregiver's understanding of the disease process, the support resources that are available to them, and even their stress levels.
Great. I do think that is something that often can be overlooked. People talk about the importance of the ecosystem and across, all the different aspects that are impacting the patient, but often it's not seen that just another individual that needs to be identified and resources developed specifically for their needs as a caregiver. And we've seen that start to be an area that has been growing, and we've encouraged that there are not just sharing the patient's information, but also having support programs that are specific for the caregivers. And because we believe that that actually makes a huge impact, again, on the health outcomes that will be achieved by the patient. So another question we have here, Dan, is, I could touch on this one. It's how does a clinical educator and their field sales or payer overlaps create effective teamwork to optimize the CE? So if I understand this question correctly, I think we touched on this to some degree, but let me hit on a little bit more. I think it all first begins with outlining clear roles and responsibilities. Again, that often sort of sounds like a no-brainer, but it should be discussed in a level of detail of almost role-playing of certain situations that could come up, and making sure that there's clear understanding of what you should do in a number of different situations. So being very clear about the roles. Again, the role for the clinical educator is to educate. It is not to be influencing on any component of sales component. It is then making sure that healthcare professionals are aware of the services that are available and aware of then, ways to be managing side effect profile and that sort of thing that specifically addresses the needs of the patient. And then obviously it is the clinical educator is the only one that is having direct impact with the patient. So the roles and responsibilities is the first place to start. The second part is making sure that there's ongoing communication, because even as good as all the training is going to be and the discussions and the role playing and the different scenarios, that there will be issues that will come up that will have been unforeseen. So over communicating and getting back and talking through certain situations. All part of that too is making sure that compliance and legal are being incorporated into those discussions as needed. And then there's just this level of coordination. Typically, there are different stakeholders that each of the field representatives, be it the sales, the clinical educator, and the reimbursement manager, are all sort of addressing within an office. And so there should be good coordination, of course, but often the coordination just happens because they're actually going to be addressing different individual needs within that office, if that makes sense. So I don't think that the coordination should be overstated. I think that is an area that naturally comes about. Okay, I think we have time for maybe, should we do one more question, Dan, or do you want us to close it out now?
No, let's do one more.
Okay. So this one is, again, this I think is on everyone's mind right now. This question says, when engaging directly with patients, how do you overcome barriers to legal and regulatory approval of the program? So I first would reword this, if it would be okay, it's not sort of about overcoming the barriers to legal and regulatory approval. It's about how do you incorporate, the legal and regulatory requirements into the program. And I fundamentally believe that the most successful programs are absolutely regulatory compliant. I believe that it requires discipline and that it requires sometimes greater thought on how to approach certain situations, but it's almost taking the easy way out if feels like there's a need to sort of overcome the barrier. So it's proactively collaboration with legal, compliance, regulatory, and the brand, of course, and medical. And so I think having those everyone involved early on is absolutely essential, because it builds the sort of foundation, even the foundation of trust within that group. I do believe that it's important to have an experienced partner, whatever company they're working with. It's at least assessing and talking about their background and addressing compliance and regulatory. How large is their compliance organization? How are they ensuring that the teams are staying abreast? We have thousands and thousands of hours that we require every single employee to be going through for compliance training. And I think that should be a minimum expectation across any partner. Obviously, the program design and thinking about how we engaging directly with patients, but being clear about the objectives, intent, and purpose. And then again, we've talked about roles and responsibilities. So I don't think that it's difficult. I think that it just requires planning and discipline and then thoughtful auditing on an ongoing basis. But I fundamentally believe that The FDA wants patients to have better outcomes. I know that they do. We know that providers do. Obviously, patients do, and the biopharma companies. So there is aligned goals across all the different core stakeholders. It's just about then working within certain parameters that have been put out. So I think that's probably all the questions that we can address. We will look through the rest of those questions and put together a response and send that out as well. If we can do that, Dan, does that work?
That works great. It's always good to follow up with our attendees with some additional information. So yes, as Andrea said, that's all the time we have for Q&A. We probably could have done another hour looking at all the great questions that have come in, but we want to respect everyone's time. So I do encourage you to contact our experts after the webinar. They're truly interested in hearing from you to talk more about this topic. So if you still have a question or comment, please send an email to one of the addresses on the screen. So we're just about at the end. Andrea, any final thoughts or words of wisdom?
Words of wisdom. Well, not sure about that, but I do just want to thank everyone for joining us. We appreciate the participation, not only in the polls, but in the great questions and the plethora of questions that have come in. Great engaging questions. And as Dan said, we do encourage anyone to reach out to us for any reason, for just questions about nurse educator programs or experience that we've had within rare disease. Could be within this life or even in our prior, biopharma and Tammy's prior nursing life. So any questions that you have, any follow-up questions, we'd love to hear from you and appreciate you giving us your hour.
Yes, thank you,
Thanks.
everyone.
Okay, so I hope you all enjoyed this event and have taken away some new insights. I'd like to once again thank our friends at VMS Biomarketing for partnering with us on a great event. I'd also like to encourage you to look for future web seminars by visiting pharmavoice.com. Thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your day. The event is now over.